You'll never amount to anything, Clara. Not with that choices. Not with that attitude. Those words weren't said by a school bully or an enemy. They came from my own father, spoken with the kind of casual cruelty only someone who thinks they own your future can deliver. And for years I believed him. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every moment where my brother was celebrated while I was politely ignored. Those words echoed. I was the afterthought, the cautionary tale, the daughter who wasted her potential. But life has a funny way of turning the tables. Because 5 years after my father dismissed me, I walked into the very company where he and my brother had built their empire, and I wasn't there as the failure they remembered. I was there with the power to decide their future. And I made sure they felt every ounce of the disrespect they had poured into me. This is the story of how I went from being nothing in my father's eyes to the one person who held everything in her hands. Before I dive in, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told you weren't enough, this story is for you. Hit like if you believe in quiet revenge, subscribe if you love long-form confessions where justice finally catches up, and don't forget to share your own stories in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to where it all started. The driveway looked smaller than I remembered. My old beat-up sedan used to fit here without a problem, but now, pulling up in a rented black SUV, everything felt sharper, foreign. My parents' house hadn't changed. The cracked front steps, the wilted hedges, the same faded welcome mat my mother had bought when I was 12. It was like time stood still, except for me. I sat for a moment, letting the hum of the heater die. My palms were dry, military calm, but my stomach still churned. That house had a way of making me small before I even walked through the door. The porch light cast a dull yellow glow over the chipped door frame. I rang the bell, out of habit. "It's open!" my mother called from the kitchen. Of course it was. It always was. Inside, the same floral candle scent hit me, cloying and nostalgic in a way that wasn't comforting. The walls were crowded with family photos, my brother's graduation, his wedding, his 2 perfect kids framed like royalty. But there wasn't a single picture of me in uniform, not even the commissioning portrait I had sent years ago. "Dinner's almost ready," Mum said without looking up. "Ethan and Rachel are on their way. Ethan just got another promotion, you'll never believe it." I smiled politely. "That's great, Mum. He's leading the systems division now. Everyone at your father's company says he's going places." That phrase used to gut me. Going places. It always sounded like a train I'd missed. Now it was just noise. The dining room table was set for 6. The placements were unspoken but clear. Ethan at the head, Dad at his right, Mom tucked between them, and me somewhere that didn't matter. Ethan and Rachel arrived right on time, of course. He wore the kind of tailored blazer that screamed success without effort. She carried a bottle of wine none of us would enjoy, but would all pretend to appreciate. "Clara," Ethan said, hugging me like it was obligatory before shifting his attention immediately toward Dad. "Long time. 5 years," I replied. He blinked, unsure if I was joking. I wasn't. We ate roast beef, mashed potatoes, the same side salad Mum had made since I was 10. Ethan held court easily, spinning tales of corporate restructures, performance bonuses, government partnerships. Dad glowed with pride, eyes never leaving him. "And you?" Mum asked finally, her voice polite but hollow. "Still traveling, more or less," I said, sipping water. "Still a captain?" Dad asked without looking up. "Something like that," Ethan smirked. "Must be tough being in the field all the time. No long-term strategy, right? Just following orders." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Upstairs, folded neatly in my suitcase, was my full uniform, the insignia gleaming. They had no idea. Tomorrow, they'd learn exactly how much strategy I was responsible for. But tonight, I let them talk. It would be the last time they spoke over me. The morning after that dinner, I lay awake on the stiff guest bed in my parents' house, staring at the popcorn ceiling. I could hear the faint hum of the coffee maker downstairs, the clink of cups, the voices of my parents murmuring as they started their day. It was all so familiar, so ordinary, and yet every sound gnawed at me. It was the same house where I had grown up hearing the same refrain. Why can't you be more like Ethan? The words had wrapped around my ribs like wires for as long as I could remember, tightening every time I tried to breathe differently than they expected. Ethan was their golden boy, straight A's, varsity sports, smooth talking his way into leadership roles before he even understood responsibility. And me? I was the daughter who wasted potential, who always chose the hard way. I remembered being 15, sitting at this very table, while Dad flipped through my report card. Bob's in math. Really, Clara, you'll never get anywhere if you can't keep up. Look at your brother, perfect scores. He'll make something of himself. You, though, you'll be lucky if you don't drag yourself into mediocrity. Mom had tried to soften it with a smile, adding, your brother just applies himself more, dear. You're too impulsive. Impulsive. That was the polite word for disappointment. I carried those words with me like stones in a backpack when I left for college. I thought maybe distance would dilute them. But even from states away, the phone calls kept coming. Ethan's internship is at Dad's firm. Such an opportunity. Your brother just bought a condo downtown. Ethan proposed to Rachel. They're thinking of starting a family soon. And then the dagger. What about you, Clara? Still figuring things out? Figuring things out? As if my life was a messy puzzle I was too slow to solve. What they didn't know was that while Ethan was climbing the predictable rungs of the corporate ladder, I was bleeding and sweating through training that most people couldn't survive a week of. While they dismissed me as drifting, I was learning to command people's lives in situations that left no room for hesitation. But I didn't tell them. Not yet. I swallowed their dismissals, their silence, their smug comparisons. Because I knew one day, if I played my cards right, their ignorance would become my weapon. Still, there were nights, more than I cared to admit, where the loneliness threatened to break me. Nights when I was curled on a bunk in a distant country, the smell of sweat and dust in the air, clutching a photo of my family, even though I hated them. Nights when exhaustion hollowed me out so badly that my father's words found their way back in. You'll never amount to anything. Sometimes I believed him. Sometimes, under the weight of failure or injury or fear, I whispered to myself, maybe he was right. But the next morning, I always got up. Always pulled on the boots. Always show I felt all the same madness. Because if there was one thing I refused to give him, it was the satisfaction of being right about me. The worst was the holidays. Every Christmas I'd fly home if I could, and every Christmas the script repeated itself. Ethan got another promotion, Mom would beam as she poured wine. Effen's team landed a government contract, Dad would add, raising his glass. And Clara, Rachel would ask sweetly, her voice dripping with condescension. Still traveling? They all laughed politely, as if I were a child who hadn't quite grown into herself. I'd sit there fork in hand, my face a mask of polite indifference. Inside, though, I was screaming. Because what I wanted to say was, I've saved lives, I've led missions you wouldn't survive a day of, I've been places you only read about in headlines. But instead, I let them believe I was still finding myself. That silence was its own kind of violence. There were moments I almost broke, times when I thought maybe I should just throw them a bone, tell them a piece of the truth so they'd stop treating me like a failure. But every time I got close, I remembered the look in Dad's eyes the day I told him I was joining the service. He'd laughed, not with humor, with derision. You couldn't even handle soccer tryouts without crying. You'll quit within a month, and when you do, don't come crying to us. You'll never be anything, Clara. Not in this family, not out there. That sentence had branded itself into my brain. And so I kept my silence. Because I realized something. Their disbelief was my camouflage. The less they thought of me, the more devastating it would be when the truth came crashing down. But silence has a cost. It wears you down. I started second-guessing myself in small ways. If my commanding officer praised me, I wondered if it was just pity. If I completed a tough assignment, I wondered if it was luck. My father's voice had burrowed so deep that sometimes I couldn't tell where his scorn ended and my own thoughts began. I started keeping a journal, just to counteract it. Page after page of evidence against him. Today I led a squad through hostile terrain. Today I negotiated a deal that saved 3 civilians. Today I didn't quit. It sounds small, but those entries kept me sane. They reminded me that no matter what he said, I was building something real. Ethan, meanwhile, thrived. At least on paper. His life was curated perfection. The LinkedIn updates, the holiday newsletters, the new car every 2 years. My parents lived for his milestones, parading them to anyone who'd listen. At one Thanksgiving, Dad even said, "Ethan is everything a son should be. Reliable, ambitious, successful." The words hung in the air like a knife pressed against my throat. Mom had glanced at me, her smile tight, as if to soften the blow. But she didn't contradict him. She never did. That night, I lay in bed in the old guest room, staring at the ceiling, my fists clenched under the blanket. The house was quiet, but my head wasn't. His words replayed over and over until my jaw ached from grinding my teeth. It was in that moment I decided, one day, I would make them eat every word. The escalation came not in a single event, but in the steady build-up of contempt. When I was promoted twice, they never called. When I sent postcards from overseas, they tossed them in a drawer. When I visited home after months away, they asked no questions. They didn't want to know me. They wanted to keep the version of me that made them feel superior. And so I gave it to them. I smiled politely, played the lost daughter, let Ethan's shadow fall over me. How? Because every slight, every dismissal, every whispered comparison was another log on the fire I was building. The final straw came during one summer barbecue. Ethan's company had just announced a partnership with a major client, and Dad was practically vibrating with pride. "To Ethan," he toasted, raising his glass. "Proof that hard work and discipline always pay off. Unlike, well," his eyes slid to me. The guests chuckled awkwardly. My face burned, but I didn't flinch. I raised my own glass. "To Ethan," I echoed, my voice calm. But inside, something hardened. Because I knew something they didn't. In less than 6 months, our worlds would collide. And for once, I wouldn't be the one sitting quietly at the table. I'd be the one at the head of it. Revenge rarely arrives in a lightning bolt. It builds slowly, in quiet rooms and long nights. In decisions that seem small, until you look back and realize they were all steps toward a single moment. For me, the turning point came on a humid night overseas, months before that fateful dinner. I was standing in a makeshift command center, fluorescent lights buzzing above, when my commanding officer handed me a folder. "Captain, this one's yours." Inside was a contract proposal. Civilian contractors, corporate partners. I scanned the letterhead, and my breath caught. Carter and Sons Logistics. My family's company. The very empire Dad had built. The throne Ethan had been groomed for since birth. And now, here it was, begging for approval. My approval. I schooled my face into neutrality, but inside, my pulse hammered. The universe had just placed my family's pride directly in my hands. That was the moment the fire in me shifted. Until then, revenge had been an abstract dream, something I whispered about to myself in the dark, A fantasy where I said all the things I never dared in their dining room. But with that folder in my hand, it became tangible. I wasn't just Clara, the overlooked daughter. I was Captain Clara Harris, officer with signing authority on contracts that could make or break corporations. And Carter and Sons needed me more than I needed them. I didn't strike immediately. Patience is a weapon too. First, I read their proposal. It was slick, polished, dripping with the kind of corporate arrogance I'd grown up choking on. Promises of efficiency and streamlined supply chains. Ethan's name appeared in the closing signature, a flourish of pride. They wanted a multi-year contract that would funnel millions into their company. Millions, they assumed, were already theirs. I smiled as I set the folder down. The planning began that night. Step 1. Learn everything. If there was one thing military life taught me, it was that intel wins battles before they're fought. I dug deep. Audits, performance records, employee reviews. What I found didn't surprise me. Behind the glossy numbers, Carter and Sons cut corners. Ugh. Everything that cuts me was too shocking to get back to the problem. Unsafe work conditions, inflated billing practices, nepotism woven into every promotion chart. Ethan wasn't just coasting on Dad's name. He was actively screwing up, but no one ever called him on it. Why would they? He was the golden boy. But I would. Step 2. Build allies. Revenge isn't just about evidence. It's about witnesses. You need people ready to see the truth when you finally reveal it. I started quietly, reaching out to colleagues I trusted. I framed it casually. Have you heard of Carter and Sons? Thinking of reviewing their proposal. The reactions were telling. One senior officer grimaced. I've dealt with them. Overpromise, underdeliver. Wouldn't touch them if I didn't have to. Another laughed bitterly. Nepotism central. If you're not a Carter, you're nothing there. Every offhand comment was a nail in the coffin. And I made sure to save every piece of it. Step 3. Prepare the stage. Revenge isn't satisfying if it happens in the shadows. No. I wanted Dad and Ethan to fall in the spotlight they loved so much. The perfect opportunity came when the board scheduled an in-person evaluation of major contractors, a formal presentation, executives, military liaisons, the kind of event where reputations are made or shattered. I secured my place on the panel quietly. No one needed to know yet that I was a Harris. To them, I was Captain Clara, neutral evaluator. The irony tasted sweet. In the weeks leading up to the presentation, I rehearsed my role. Not just the official questions, but the reveal. I imagined Ethan's face when he walked into that room and saw me at the table. I imagined Dad's expression when he realized the daughter he dismissed now held the pen that could ruin him. But this wasn't about petty fantasy. This was strategy. Because revenge isn't just saying, look at me now. It's saying, you can't look away. The hardest part was keeping my cool in the meantime. After that dinner at their house, when Dad once again praised Ethan and mocked me, I wanted so badly to drop the truth right there, to tell him, I am the one holding your future. I am the one deciding if your empire survives. But I bit my tongue, because silence is sharper when you break it at the perfect moment. During those weeks, I started journaling differently. No longer just notes of survival, but battle plans. Pages filled with bullet points, timelines, evidence lists. It felt like charting a mission, because it was. Only this time the enemy wasn't faceless. It had my father's eyes and my brother's smirk. And for the first time in years, the voice in my head wasn't Dad's, telling me I'd never be anything. It was mine, steady and certain. They will see you. They will regret underestimating you. The night before the presentation, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, the glow of the desk lamp painting the room in gold. Marcus, my friend and closest confidant, sat across from me, sipping coffee. You ready for this? He asked. I looked at him. the corners of my mouth twitching into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I've been ready for this my whole life," he nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow, you don't just walk into that room, you own it." And that's exactly what I planned to do. The folder with Carter and Sons logo sat on the desk between us. For years, that name had towered over me like a shadow. Tomorrow, I would tear it down, brick by brick. Not with anger, not with screaming, with the calm, calculated precision of someone who had been underestimated too many times and had finally decided to stop playing small. The morning of the presentation, the air felt electric, like the charged stillness before a storm. I stood in front of the mirror in my hotel room, fastening the last button on my uniform. The insignia on my chest gleamed under the soft light, the years of blood and grit it represented compressed into those few silver lines. For once, I didn't feel the weight of it. I felt its strength. This wasn't just fabric and metal. It was armor, proof. The truth they had ignored was stitched into every fiber. I took one last look at myself and whispered under my breath, "They're not ready for you." The conference center buzzed with energy when I arrived. Rows of tables, glossy handouts, men and women in sharp suits exchanging handshakes and rehearsed laughter. The air smelled of coffee, polished wood, and ambition. I moved through the room with measured steps, acknowledging greetings from colleagues, but inside I was scanning for them. And then there they were. Dad, in his tailored grey suit, his hair slicked back, his presence as commanding as ever. Ethan beside him, exuding the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no. Their company logo shone on the banner behind their booth. Carter and Sons Logistics, built on integrity. The irony almost made me laugh. Dad was holding court, shaking hands, promising efficiency and reliability with that politician's smile of his. Ethan hovered, chiming in with statistics he probably barely understood. They didn't see me yet. Not really. Not until the panel convened. We gathered in the main hall. Rows of chairs faced a stage with a long table draped in navy cloth. Microphones gleamed under the lights. Behind us, a massive screen waited to project slides and numbers that would decide contracts worth millions. I took my seat at the center of the panel. When Dad and Ethan entered, carrying their presentation materials, I caught the exact moment their eyes found me. Dad's confident stride faltered for half a beat. Ethan blinked, his mouth twitching in confusion. "Clara?" he mouthed. I didn't acknowledge them. I simply adjusted my papers, leaned back in my chair, and let the silence sting. The moderator introduced the session. Next up, Carter and Sons Logistics, represented by Charles and Ethan Carter. Their proposal has been shortlisted for multi-year contracts supporting our overseas operations. Applause rippled through the hall. Dad stepped forward, projecting his booming voice with practiced ease. "Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. For over 3 decades, Carter and Sons has stood for reliability, innovation, and trust. Today, we present not just a proposal, but a partnership." He clicked the remote, and the screen lit up with glossy slides. Bar graphs soared, pie charts gleamed. Ethan took over halfway through, rattling off percentages and projections with the smug cadence of someone certain the room was eating it up. And for a while they were. Heads nodded, pens scribbled notes. Then came the question period. I leaned into the microphone, my voice calm but firm. "Captain Clara Harris, I have a few questions." The room shifted. Some heads turned, recognizing the name. My father's jaw tightened. Ethan's smile wavered. I flipped open their proposal, my pen tapping lightly on the table. Page 14. You cite a 98% on-time delivery rate. Can you clarify the methodology for that statistic? Because the audit I reviewed shows closer to 74% when accounting for overseas shipments. Ethan blinked. Well, different datasets. So, inflated numbers, I cut in smoothly. Murmurs stirred in the audience. Dad cleared his throat, stepping in. Captain, with respect, our internal audits may not align with military records, but our clients have always been satisfied. Not according to the 3 letters of complaint attached in the appendix. I slid the copies across the table for the panel to see. Gasps whispered through the rows. I kept going, each question sharper than the last. Safety violations, employee turnover, nepotism flagged in HR reviews. Every time they tried to recover, I hit them with documentation. Every smile Dad forced cracked a little more. Every attempt Ethan made to sound confident stumbled into stuttering. The audience was no longer nodding. They were watching, hungry, fascinated, like witnesses to a slow-motion car crash. And I wasn't done. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch. Then I said it. Mr. Carter, Ethan, do you recognize me? The room stilled. Dad's lips pressed into a thin line. Of course we do, Clara. Then you know I'm not just an evaluator. I let my gaze sweep across the audience before locking eyes with them again. I'm your daughter, the one you dismissed, the one you told would never amount to anything. Gasps rippled through the hall. Whispers darted between rows. I leaned forward, voice steady as stone. And today, I hold the authority to decide whether your company continues in this industry or collapses under the weight of its own lies. The color drained from Ethan's face. Dad's bravado cracked, his fists tightening at his sides. You're making this personal, he spat, his voice low, desperate. No, I replied. You made it personal the day you chose your pride over your daughter. I'm just finally giving you the accountability you taught me to fear. The silence that followed was louder than any applause. The panel chair cleared his throat. Captain Harris, do you recommend approval of this proposal? Every eye in the room turned to me. I let the pause hang, savoring the weight of it. Then, with a calm I'd never felt before, I said, no. I recommend rejection on grounds of integrity violations, unsafe practices, and falsified records. Carter & Sons is unfit for this contract. The gavel fell. Decision recorded. The empire my father had built, the crown Ethan had been promised, it all crumbled in that instant. As the session ended, people stood, some shaking their heads, others whispering furiously. Dad and Ethan stood frozen, papers clutched in their hands like lifelines cut loose. I gathered my materials slowly, deliberately. As I passed them on my way out, I stopped, looked them both in the eye. You told me I'd never be anything, I said quietly. Turns out, I'm the reason you're nothing. And then I walked away, leaving them in the ruins of their arrogance. The echo of my footsteps down that carpeted hall was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. I didn't even need the applause. The silence, the raw, stunned silence, was more powerful than a stadium's roar. By the time I reached the lobby, my phone buzzed with messages. Colleagues, old contacts, even superiors who hadn't been in the room but had already heard whispers. Captain Harris dismantled Carter & Sons. You should have seen it. The daughter took them apart. The story was moving fast, faster than I'd expected. Within days, Carter & Sons was reeling. The contract rejection was public record, but what really gutted them was the word-of-mouth storm that followed. Other clients started to review their own partnerships. Old complaints resurfaced. Journalists caught wind of the drama. Military captain exposes family empire for corruption. It was brutal, deliciously brutal. Dad tried damage control first. He went on local radio, his voice all righteous indignation. It was a misunderstanding, a personal vendetta. She's confused, misguided, she doesn't understand business. But the more he spoke, the worse it got. because every denial was countered with documents I had already made sure were available to the right eyes. Every attempt to paint me as unstable only highlighted his arrogance. Ethan crumbled faster. Without Dad's booming confidence to shield him, he was exposed for what he really was, a fraud propped up by nepotism. His team turned on him. One by one, the people he'd bragged about leading resigned or leaked stories of his incompetence. Within 6 months, Carter and Sons filed for bankruptcy. The empire was gone. And me. For the first time in years, I felt light. Not euphoric, not the manic joy I once fantasized revenge would bring. It was quieter than that, a deep exhale, a loosening of muscles I hadn't realized were clenched for decades. It wasn't about watching them burn. It was about finally stepping out of their shadow. Still, the fallout rippled in personal ways I hadn't anticipated. Family friends who once gushed about Dad's sacrifice now avoided eye contact in grocery store aisles. Relatives who used to send me pitying holiday cards reached out privately saying, "We had no idea." Mom called once. Her voice was brittle, carrying that mix of shame and pleading. "Did you have to do it that way? Couldn't you have handled it privately?" I let the silence hang before answering. "No, Mum. They humiliated me publicly for years. They don't get the courtesy of privacy." She didn't call again. The strangest moment came when I ran into Rachel, Ethan's wife, at a cafe months later. She looked thinner, worn out, but her eyes were still sharp. "Congratulations," she said bitterly, folding her arms. "But now, I find that they are the mother." When you say they were, I think they do feel better. I don't want one day. You got what you wanted. I set my cup down, meeting her glare calmly. What I wanted was accountability. If Ethan had earned his position, he'd still have it. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Because she knew. The fallout wasn't just theirs, it was mine too. I had to confront who I was without their shadow to push against. For so long my father's voice had been my enemy, the thing I fought every day. Without it, there was a strange quiet. I filled it with work, with new missions, with the kind of leadership that wasn't about ego, but about responsibility. And every time I stood in front of my team, giving orders, I thought, this is who I was meant to be, not their disappointment. Not their burden, mine. One evening, months after the dust had settled, I drove back to that old house. The hedges were even more wilted, the porch light flickered weakly. Dad's car was gone, Ethan's too. The place felt smaller, emptier, like a shell. I didn't go inside. I just stood at the end of the driveway, breathing in the cool night air. And for the first time, I didn't feel small there. I felt untouchable. People always ask if revenge feels as good as you think it will. The truth, it feels better and worse than you expect. Better because standing in that room, dismantling my father's empire with nothing but facts and the authority he swore I'd never have, that was a high I'll never forget. Watching Ethan's smirk evaporate, hearing the whispers as the truth spread through the audience, knowing that their arrogance had finally collapsed under its own weight. It was intoxicating. Worse because revenge doesn't rewind time. It doesn't erase the teenage girl who cried in her room after being told she'd never be enough. It doesn't erase the years of silence at family dinners, the countless nights where my father's voice was louder in my head than my own. But maybe revenge isn't supposed to heal the past. Maybe it's supposed to clear the ground so you can build something new. That's what it did for me. I'm not the disappointment anymore. I'm not the girl who fades into the background while Ethan shines. I'm the woman who faced her oppressors, exposed their lies, and walked away stronger. And more importantly, I'm the one writing my own story now. Not Dad, not Ethan, me. When I stood at the edge of that driveway, looking at the house that once made me feel so small, I realized something. Revenge hadn't just brought them down. It had freed me, because once you faced the people who swore you'd never be anything, and proved them wrong in the most public, undeniable way, there's nothing left to fear. So now I'll ask you, what would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed quiet, swallowed the insults, and let them keep their empire? Or would you have done what I did, waited, planned, and then struck when the whole world was watching? If this story hit you the way it hit me to live it, then I want you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that like button, because no one deserves to be erased or underestimated. Second, subscribe for more stories just like this, where betrayal doesn't get the last word and justice finally gets its moment. And third, drop your story in the comments. Tell me about the time someone told you that you'd never be enough. Tell me how you proved them wrong, or how you're planning to, because every voice deserves to be heard. This was my revenge. This was my justice. And if you've ever been underestimated, you know it's not just sweet, it's survival. Until next time, remember, sometimes the best revenge is patience, and sometimes it's letting the truth speak louder than the lies.